In our global village, we need shared universal values that transcends national and religious self-interest so that we can coexist peacefully with others and between nations. Values allow people to understand each other, stabilize human interactions, and values-driven behavior increase cooperation and trust. To act morally in an interconnected world, we need to know how the world operates. We can't operate out of ignorance. And what the problems are. The greatest crimes in history resulted not from hatred or greed, but from ignorance and indifference. Hence, our first universal value emerges. We need to care enough to seek to understand the problems we face as a human race. Since the beginning of history, humankind has been faced with four great enemies: ignorance, conflict, famine, and disease. To overcome these, people of the world must work together. And the first step is for us to find shared values that will underpin this cooperation. Well, you may ask, do shared values really exist? In 1947, the United Nations convened a group of world's best-known philosophers to study whether an agreement on basic principles was conceivable. A conclusion was reached that some things are so terrible in practice that almost no one will publicly approve of them, and that there are certain public goods that are so widely valued that almost no one would oppose them. Hence, in 1948, the UN General Assembly approved the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is a start on the important journey towards universally shared values. Yet despite this great achievement, we are still on the journey, and we still lack consensus about universally shared values. So what are the obstacles for us to find these shared values? The first obstacle is selfishness. It is hard to find common ground or common good when selfishness is the motivation. The first step is overcoming this obstacle, is changing the selfish mindset to an unselfish one. The division, corruption, injustice, and conflict in the world is ultimately a conflict of values based on self-centered values. The second obstacle is the need to formulate a convincing values framework that will appeal to the minds and hearts of human beings. Religious traditions in history have played a very significant role in fostering shared values. However, in the minds of many contemporary, this has been a problem. Religious expressions of values are no longer convincing, and hence, a new expression of moral and ethics needs to arise that individuals will find clear and compelling. A system of thought that unites past, present, secular, and religious thought, and philosophy and science can provide such a new expression of values and morality. The third obstacle is the idea that value-free choices exist. This is a contradiction in terms because value judgments are preconditions for the choices and actions we consider important. As a human race, we've made values judgments as to what we consider is better. Justice and human rights are better than injustice. Altruism is better than selfishness. Honesty is better than dishonesty. And empathy is better than callousness. The fourth obstacle is the certain absence, if you like, of a global mindset in the minds of human beings today. We need shared values in the global village, and without shared values, we cannot set clear global policies about how countries, for example, will manage immigration. Well, you might say that we do, but when we see how difficult it has been to resolve the current refugee crisis around the world, we must conclude that nations have not found enough shared principles or common ground to address this crisis. We cannot determine what our shared obligations are, for example, as national or global citizens. We cannot guide scientific or technological development ethically or sustainably. We cannot set fair economic policies and rules of trade without shared values. However, we may consider shared values to be important, but this brings us to the question, what are universally shared values? And which values can be considered universal? I've been thinking about this for more than 40 years, and I'm still reading and thinking about this. Here's my humble attempt to find a value system that can be considered universal, intellectually and spiritually satisfying, authentic, and meaningful. However, right from the start, we need to recognize that listing and justifying a particular list of values as universal is a very complex exercise. First, when formulating moral frameworks, we are confronted with the pluralistic nature of society, making such formulations challenging. People believe all kinds of things. Second, moral judgments can be very subjective based on our own worldviews. Third, describing moral values leads to the recognition that multiple concerns fall within the same moral values. For example, two opposing views can draw on the same value of justice to defend their view. Who decides and how do we decide what is right? Fourth, some moral values are shared across culture, while others vary between social groups and cultures. However, relativism is not the answer either. Relativism maintains that morality is not universal. When moral relativism is pushed to its logical limits, it must be concluded that moral values, in a way, are subjective and finally, all non-rational. Hence, fearing indoctrination of a particular worldview, we may decide that it's better to stay away from defining moral values. However, relativism and permissiveness, live and let live, is not the answer either, because it holds no genuine moral authority. And the intractable conflicts that occur between when there is not shared values are very difficult to resolve. But how do we find unity of purpose when we face a crisis? And it's interesting to note that we usually look to shared values. I've been asked many times in my life by people, John, whose values? Which values? And who decides? These are valid questions. The questions I have often asked myself is, do I seek power or truth? Do I pursue morality or pleasure? Do I serve my interests or the interests of others? These are questions that we all ask ourselves. It seems to me, unfortunately, that most people spend far more time and effort pursuing power and wealth and pleasure than truth and the common good. In a consumerist world, the supreme value appears to be pleasure and happiness. In this sense, power, wealth, pleasure, knowledge, and fame could be considered the primary driving values of our age. However, it could also be argued that morality is the legacy of all humans across faith, culture, and time. Hence, what is the basis of universal values? Let us consider, to answer this question, a little bit of history. Some moral philosophies emphasize moral rules that need to be followed regardless of the situation, and these are called categorical imperatives. Hence, this means that you applying the truth and moral rules to everyone is the best way to guarantee universal morality. Let's be fair. These rules must be followed irrespective of the consequences. But most of us would say that we need to show some flexibility with rules depending on the situation. Just ask a parent. The reason for this is that moral imperatives do not always satisfy the dictates of love or the dictates of the heart. In ancient Greece, Socrates and Plato attempted to establish absolute values by pursuing true knowledge based on reasoning. However, trust in our ability to act rationally and morally based on rational thinking alone is certainly questionable today when we consider how we have managed, poorly managed, I should say, climate change. So, another approach is to judge people based on the consequences of their behaviors that contribute to the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people. Sounds good. Behavior is the basis for absolute values because values are relative based on one's views. This is why tolerance and not hurting others is so important in Western thinking. Provided that people do not harm others, all is good. Tolerance is important, but a willingness to tolerate the existence of opinion or behavior that one dislikes does not foster a willingness to understand others and care for them. If asked, well, what is the basis of morality? I would have to say it is love. There are several reasons for this. The first is that love serves the common good of others. Altruism, justice, equality, impartiality have been at the forefront of human morality for millenniums. Acts of altruism, how we serve others, are considered the highest value in all cultures. Love means to live for the sake of others. Number two, second, values centered on love are broader and more enduring than value systems or ideologies that focus on narrow beliefs. Morality based on love does not seek to achieve doctrinal consensus, but rather to seek to achieve agreement and how we can care for others. Third, love can be considered absolute because it is unchanging across culture and time and exists independently from you and me. One could say that parental love is the most unchanging aspect of human life, which exists before you and I ever came into this world. One could argue that this standard of love in the family has never changed in history, despite the fact that people have not always loved their families the way they should have. Fourth is that finally rationality is not enough for humans to act morally. The bound of love that is created between people is such a strong incentive for people to act morally towards the other. Fidelity between husband and wife, friendship, and trustworthiness are all driven by love. We may know that being faithful and trustworthy is right, but it is love that we feel for one another that drives our behaviors. You just have to be a parent, a sibling, a spouse, a friend to know that love is the basis for an absolute standard of value. We are accountable to each other based on the ethics of love, the ethics of fidelity, of justice. Fifth, love is also the basis for justice and equality, because if we love someone, we would not consider treating them unjustly. Love is the basis for equality because when love between a grandfather and a grandchild are equalized, they're the same. Husband and wife are equal in love. In love, there is no discrimination based on color or nationality because love is impartial. Finally, we need to consider what the underlying values need to be in our global village. This is important for our survival. As our world shrinks to a global village, people are challenged to overcome national, racial, religious barriers and learn to understand each other and to work and live together in harmony. All humans have obligations towards others in the human race. This is a critical, important value. A spirit of cooperation can only be attained when human beings come to view themselves as members of the same human family. We need to develop a genuine appreciation for the diversity of faith and cultural traditions. Second is we need to understand spiritual traditions, because spiritual traditions can play and have played an important role in fostering universal values that are global in nature, because historically religions have focused on the big questions of life rather than just political or narrow political and national interests. And third, from a spiritual perspective, a standard of values that serves the welfare of others and that is unchanging is based on God's love. Dr. Ramoun referred to this as the absolute value perspective. Many spiritual texts have shared a common view that the way to achieve goodness includes the ethics of love and self-sacrifice, which has formed the basis for religious virtues such as that one should love and should love and treat others as ourselves. In Hinduism, to love is to know God, and Confucianism encourages us to embrace universal love and be without partisanship. Buddhism maintains that compassion is a mind that savors only mercy and love. Once again, thank you for listening, and please subscribe to my channel.